We continue in 2 Samuel 12 after Nathan's parable to David, which ends with, as we're going to see here in verse 5, David saying to Nathan, "As the Yahweh lives, the man who has done this deserves to die," etc. And Nathan says to David, "You are the man." But the question that has bothered interpreters throughout is, which man is David? And the answer is it depends upon whose perspective we see and where in the story we read. So before I enter into the details of this scene beginning in 12:5, as I've been doing, following all the words and the details and the shape, and I'll look at that briefly here today, I just want to see what is happening in this larger chapter in terms of this little story that seems superficially to have a clear meaning, but in fact the closer we look, the more slippery it is, and really the wider we look, the more prescient it is about the entire monarchical period. So, as you can see on the right side of the screen, I've been following some of these issues related to specific elements of these chapters in 2 Samuel 11 to 12. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, I encourage you to do so, where I go over some of the questions up here that apply to the whole section. But now we're down here in this parable, and just to review a few of the things that get us here, we've been following this structure, and we're in this section here that is parallel to this other side of, I didn't call it a chiasm, but it's pretty much like a chiasm. But the point I wanted to make here, as I did last time, is that in chapter 11 we have these conversations between David and Bathsheba, David and Uriah, and David and Joab. And now Uriah's dead, and Joab's off at the war, and Bathsheba's mourning, and now it's just between Nathan and David and Yahweh, and yet it parallels, as we can see there. And we've also been looking at these key words, and one of the key words in this section here are taken and take and take and woman. We're not going to go through the whole chiasm. We're actually starting up here at the end of the parable, and we're not really going through it. But I want to highlight this whole big piece here so we can see how it fits into what I'm going to show you in a minute in terms of the various levels of interpretation. And one of the aspects of the interpretation we need to look at is what exactly is David's crime that's being charged against him here? Is it adultery? Is it murder? Or is it divine disobedience? Is it all of those or some combination of those? Depends upon who you're talking to or listening to. So, as I noted last time, there are a number of words in the immediate section here, and I wanted to bring specific attention to here, the use of the word chamal here as pity or compassion, as it relates to what David's response is. You can see on the left side of the screen having no pity here. So in the version of the story that Nathan tells, the rich man has pity or compassion on his own flock, but by implication does not on the ewelamb of the poor man. And so that's what David is responding to there. And as I was noting last time, we can see this parable as a master metaphor of the entire journey from the conquest to exile, as you can see here. And the part that's in the yellow is the immediate part of the plot. But there's an element I didn't note last time, and that's what I want to start with today, is this piece here. The traveler in our story is Judah, as the recipient later of David's offspring to be king, that is Solomon, plainly is not known to the characters in the story because it hasn't happened yet. The child that was just born at the end of chapter 11 is not Solomon. As we'll hear in chapter 12, Yahweh will strike that child sick and that child will die, and only in the next year will Bathsheba have another pregnancy, and that child will be Solomon, or Jedediah, as Nathan wants to name him, and we'll see what that means when we get there. But since we don't know this yet, the story has to mean something else now. So it depends upon who we're talking to. So let's look at it this way. And as Polzin, whose work on this parable was the grounding for the chart I just showed you, he notes this. The phrase, "you are the man," here means many things at once. David was the wayfarer, the one who comes, insofar as his past dealings with God are concerned, in 12:7 to 8. He is the rich man when his present crimes are brought into the picture in 12:9 to 10. He will be the poor man when God's punishing future for him and his house arrives in 12:11 to 12. The parable shifts in meaning as it structures the various phases of the royal history. So let's begin to just look briefly at this overview, and then next video we'll go through all the details that fill some of that in. So, as Jeremy Schipper writes in a recent article, he sees that David overinterprets the story. And one of the things we need to note here is, first of all, does David understand this as a parable or as a historical event? As I was noting last time, there's nothing that suggests it's a parable, and there's no preface at all. Nathan just starts talking to him out of nowhere. We know that Yahweh has sent Nathan to him, but as I noted last time, we don't know if this parable is a word of Yahweh or not. Because as you can see on the left side of the screen, after David's angry response, Nathan then says, in the name of Yahweh, what follows. And so these interpretations, starting in 7, 8, etc., are based on Nathan at least claiming that what he says is the word of Yahweh. But we don't know if the parable was, and David doesn't know it's a parable. So, if he interprets it simply as a historical event, that's one thing. But if he understands it's a parable, Schipper suggests it could be this way. Which is to say, not that David sees it this way. David certainly knows that he sent the message with Uriah to Joab to have Uriah killed. It wasn't his idea. But Schipper's suggesting this is David's understanding of what Nathan thinks, that Joab has done this terrible thing. And that's the overinterpretation that's at issue, because plainly that's not what's in Nathan's mind. Nathan isn't concerned here with Joab, who's not in this part of the story at all. So in that overinterpretation version, the rich man is Joab, who takes Uriah from Bathsheba and gives him to David, in the sense of has him killed, satisfying David's desire there. So that's the initial sense that David thinks that that's what Nathan thinks it's about. That Joab has done this terrible thing, and Nathan is calling David to bring down the punishment on him. But as soon as Nathan begins to speak and says, "You are the man," plainly that's not what's going on. And what I think is interesting here is, in Nathan's first version of the parable, it's Yahweh who's the rich man. And that corresponds to what I was showing here last time, is that in these situations before the immediate plot, it was Yahweh who took Saul's women, his daughter Michal and his wife Ahinoam, and gave Michal to Palti after he'd first given him to Michal, or to David, and then back to David, and then gave Ahinoam to David, which is never quite announced, but Ahinoam is named as one of David's wives, and we hear in verse 8, in Yahweh's voice through Nathan, "I gave you your master's house and your master's women," which is ambiguous. Wives makes it clear that it's Ahinoam, but it's not clear, because women could mean both Saul's wife, but also his daughter, Michal, so it could apply to both of those there. So that's in that version of it. But that's not all, because if we scroll down here, after Nathan says to David, "Thus says Yahweh," remembering the things that Yahweh did in the past, and we'll look more at this when we look in detail, but note all the first-person things of Yahweh. Plainly, this version of it is Yahweh is offended. Yahweh is not offended at the injustice of what's happened. Yahweh is offended that David has despised the word of Yahweh to do what is evil in his sight. Plainly, it's not just simply the disobedience in itself of not obeying the word as if it was just a rule to follow, but it's the doing evil that comes from not listening to the word. But in the second version of it, the issue is you struck down Uriah and took his wife. So in that version, the rich man is David, and this is the one that most people hear on the surface, and the poor man is Uriah, and the ewelamb is Bathsheba. But in that version, there's no traveler. As we hear, as Nathan reports this in Yahweh's voice, now it goes to a therefore and switches to the voice of punishment down here. But in this summary in verse 9, there's only three characters. There's just David, Uriah, and the woman who's not named here, but obviously Bathsheba. And so there's no traveler in that one. So what are we to make of that? What is the point of telling the story the way it's told if there's only 3 out of the 4 characters that correlate? We'll come back to that when we look at that in detail. Then it continues on here in the therefore. It's now about the future. So it started about the past, the more distant past of Yahweh's relationship with David, the more immediate past about Uriah and Bathsheba, and now it's heading into the future. And that's one of the lovely things that makes this a master metaphor, because it's speaking from its present in this immediate situation, both to the past as far back as one wants to look in many ways, and to the future as far forward as one wants to look. Although in the immediate context, it's just back to 1 Samuel 16 when David is anointed king in Yahweh's name, and just forward to 2 Samuel 16 when Absalom attempts to have sex with David's secondary women, or concubines, if you will, in order to claim the monarchy at that point. So we can also look at it farther, though, as it has here, all the way to exile, and including into the succession. So our vision can go backward and forward as much farther than what we see in our immediate passage. So in the reply of Nathan's reply in Yahweh's voice of judgment, we see now the rich man is again Yahweh, who will take David's women and give them to your neighbor, who is plainly Absalom, although we don't know that yet. But the shall lie with your women in the sight of this very sun is certainly anticipating that. But then we recognize there's our perspective, and that's what we're seeing here, because if we're good readers and we know the whole picture, whether we know it reading through now or whether we only know it when we've read through the whole thing or watched all my videos, however you learn the whole story, that we realize that there's the bigger picture that's going on here. That the story is largely about the monarchy itself. It's not so much concerned with the particular lives of David, Uriah, and Bathsheba, but it's concerned with the bigger questions of monarchy and the people of Israel and Judah and Yahweh and their king in relation to it. And as we saw when it was anticipated that the people would have a king back in 1 Samuel 8, the key verb that Samuel speaks on Yahweh's behalf, whether it's Yahweh's words or not, we don't know. But the key word that Samuel speaks 6 times was take, 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 take. So it should not be too surprising that what we see in the criticism here is taking. And so one can ask, is this just a criticism of a particular act of David? Is it, as Halpern suggested earlier in the century, that this story is here actually as a distraction to draw our attention to this one evil thing David did, but to divert us from paying attention to the much greater evils he did, the much greater killings and assassinations and treacheries that he's done? Is it ultimately hinting that it's anti-monarchical, that in the end, monarchy itself is the problem, and you'll end up in exile if you don't rely on Yahweh alone as a king? Do we have to separate sources for that, or can we recognize that within this story is both a pro-David story, an anti-David story, a pro-monarchy story, and an anti-monarchy story? Which is to say, depending upon how David acts or depending upon how kings act, it's either pro or against. It's not saying that monarchy is just good or monarchy is just bad. It's saying monarchy might be okay, although it's a betrayal of God in the first place, but not if kings act the way David is acting here by taking, taking, taking. You can only imagine it's good if there's a king who doesn't do that kind of thing. And perhaps in the perspective of the author of the Deuteromistic history, that will be Josiah, who will be named there by the narrator as there is no king before or after him who is as great as he was. And he's not accused of taking there. He's celebrated for his so-called reform, which is to centralize all worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem in anticipation of the Babylonian incursion, which of course fails and exile happens. But that's to say that as we continue through the story and as we continue through what follows with the fall of the house of David, we can hear these multiple voices, whether from one source or from multiple sources woven together here, that raise both positive and negative things about the behavior of David and the behavior and question of monarchy in general. So we'll see you next time as we begin back in verse 5 to look at the details of the story in light of these multiple perspectives. See you for that. Bye-bye.